should we start with Q&A related to the tafsir?
I think so, yeah. Related to the tafsir, and then we'll move on to more broad.
Okay, so let's take like a couple of questions. I mean, let's like hear them, and then we'll let the professor. So, Amir, I know you had some questions.
Yes, I do.
I think that there were a couple of hands back there too.
All right, well, let's start. Did you want to, or should we start?
I think.
Okay, go ahead.
Just really quickly, I don't know how significant this is, but in these particular verses, the Sabi'in are not mentioned, but they're mentioned in other places of the Quran. Any particular significance?
Yeah, no. Oh,
Yeah,
I should have answered.
That's okay, and then audit, and then
Keep
and
track.
then
You keep track.
Me keep track? Well,
Yeah,
I
me
just
too,
said-
but I just don't.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know.
Audit and then.
I have a question regarding verse 2, scriptures purified, and then verse 3, wherein our books are upright. I'm just wondering if you'd like to, if you have time, provide some Sufi translation for it, because I think all the messages is actually coming from a same place, just like a human comes from the same form, like a clot of blood and whatnot.
Yeah, so I had, can I have 2 questions? Can I do that?
Okay.
Thank you, appreciate it. So, one is, I've read that there weren't, the Bible as we know it, there weren't any copies in Arabia until well after Islam was established. So I'm curious how the Christian communities and the Jewish communities actually kind of knew about the Prophet in the first place, if that's true. And the second question is, how is this source historically contingent? Because I'm looking at the verbs and they're all in the present tense, like the present continuous, meaning that like the action hasn't been perfected yet. So I'm wondering, how did the Mufassirun, how did they say that this is historically contingent if all the verbs are in the present tense? Or at least all the verbs that I can see.
Okay. It's called, when you take a present tense to mean past tense, it's called tabaid. It's not that unusual in classical Arabic, actually. I mean, it's maybe in standard modern Arabic it is. But and if I want to give you an example. Grammatically, it's حتى تأتيهم يوم قال ابن عرفة أي حتى أتتهم لفظه لفظ المضارع ومعناه الماضي وهذا كقوله ما تتلو الشياطين أي ما تلت وقد مر بيان and so on. So for instance, when the Quran says وما تتلو الشياطين, it's using present tense, but it means ما تلت الشياطين. What the shayateen has mentioned, have already recited in the past. And so you know, حتى لفظه لفظ مضارع ومعناه الماضي, that's not unusual in Arabic at all. It's a present tense, but what you're actually referring to is something in the past. You can read, especially in some of the tafsirs are focused on grammar. Predominantly, and if you're interested in reading a full explanation of the grammatical aspects, refer to one of these tafsirs, because you'll get what you want and much more. I mean, this discussion goes on for pages, and it's, yeah, I don't think it will be anyway.
The Bible being...
Oh, the Bible. Yeah. Well, I think that that's a very problematic claim. We also know that the Quran documents the accusation of the opponents of the Prophet ﷺ, that he is accused of reading the texts of the Jews and Christians, and then the Quran says, but he doesn't read that he's accused that tumla alayh, that the Jews and Christians recite to him the stories of the biblical prophets, and then that he relates it. And with these types of accusations, and what does it mean to say that they didn't have a copy? Because we know that copies did exist in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen. And how can any historian claim that a copy didn't pass through Arabia, considering what we know about the trade between Yemen and Sham and Iraq? So I don't put too much weight on that claim. I mean, I've read it, and I thought it's shooting from the hip. The fact that archaeological evidence hasn't been found, so what? Arabia was not a good place for the preservation of archaeological evidence, and whatever archaeological evidence that did exist, alhamdulillah, the Wahhabis took care of that and destroyed all of it. So, and even modern day Saudi Arabia doesn't allow for any archaeological excavations anyway. So even if something does miraculously have survived the Wahhabi cleansing, which would be true miracle, until real archaeological work. One of the things that, the Yemeni war is disastrous at every level, at every nuance, in every sense. But one of the saddest things about Yemen is gold mine of archaeological information that was just waiting to be tapped. And what's going on in Yemen is further destroying, as if we needed more destruction of history. So the point about the Sabi'a, there is the tafsirs. Actually, very interestingly, they do mention whether when the Quran says Ahl al-Kitab, does it always, in its reference to Ahl al-Kitab, does it always also mean Ashab al-Zabur, and of course the Christian Jews, the Sabi'a, and then it always has a discussion whether the Zoroastrians are among Ahl Kitab or not. I just skipped that part because most modern Muslims don't know who the Sabi'a is and don't care. But that is a standard part of the discussion. When it says Ahl Kitab, and in fact the majority say it is not just the Christians and Jews. The Ahl Kitab is referring to all of Ahl Kitab. But interestingly, this whole thing about historical contingency, as far as I know, it was the Christians and Jews in particular who got into this entire debate about the awaited Messiah. We don't have anything about the Sabi'a or the Zoroastrians, for that matter, awaiting the Messiah, which is interesting. There was another question I'm forgetting.
Sufi translation for scriptures purified.
The Mutahhara and Qayyima. Yeah, that's a good question. They do. I think your question was the difference between the two?
No, I'm just wondering, because the Prophet Muhammad is a Hanafi revelation that's supposed to be innate with human intellectual wisdom.
Yeah.
Is based on these scriptures, and you sort of skipped the Lawh Mahfuz part, and I was wondering if there's any like Sufi translation that sort of refers to that particular, because everything comes from the same tablet, I would assume.
Well, it goes. I mean, I'm not. The reference here is كتب قيمة وصحف مطهرة. What I will, what I, what they always, the discussion that you find in the tafsir, I'm not sure about the translation, because, but is whether when it said what the precise meaning of qayyima and why it used qayyima in one context and mutahara in another context. Oh, I got what you're referring to. Is that when it says فيها كتب قيمة, that's the third verse. فيها كتب قيمة. Not all the mufassirun, but I think it's would be fair to say a majority, and not not an overwhelming majority, but maybe same percentages is dangerous, but maybe 55% of it. Said when it says فيها كتب قيمة, that this is referring to the Quranic revelation incorporating the previous revelations. And what the point that I was making is that this is a theme repeated in the Quran frequently, that the Quranic revelation is an affirmation of earlier revelations. So when it says فيها كتب قيمة, the kutub qayyimah here is a reference to the earlier revelations that the Quran affirmed. And then I was editorializing upon this and saying that earlier theologians would often quote the Bible and the Torah to the extent that they didn't contradict the Quran, and that quite often they don't contradict the Quran. الصحف المطهرة, they took that, or most of them took that to mean the revelation as it comes from Allah, not the Bible or the Torah or even the text of the Quran itself, but the very concept of Allah's revelation itself. That's the distinction that I was referring to. Now, those who didn't think that Kutub al-Qayyimah referred to the earlier revelation, meaning the revelation incorporated by reference. I'll give you an example of what they say. So they said, well, basically that it could possibly be just referring to the Quran. But that doesn't answer, well, why kutubun qayyima? Why the plural? And that's why then most say وهي التوراة والإنجيل والزبور كأن هذا القرآن في تلك الكتب, meaning that وتلك الكتب في هذا القرآن, that the Quran itself, in affirming the earlier revelation, with correcting it's what the things that Islam doesn't accept, but it is affirming the truth of earlier revelation. The Quran, Islam didn't come with, it didn't abrogate everything before it. we Muslims, as a Muslim, you have to believe in the Bible and the Torah, and if you care enough to, and again, it's for scholars, not for. I mean, you couldn't be a scholar of the Quran without studying the Bible and the Torah. It's just in modern today, of course, you find scholars of the Quran or so-called scholars of the Quran that have never bothered to read the Bible and the Torah, but that was unthinkable in before modernity.
Yeah. I don't know if this can be a question or not, but just referring to your arguments about the difference between Suhuf and Kutub, can we, I mean, if you think about the history of the Quran and how it was collected, we see a lot of references to Suhuf or Masahif or Mushaf, and can we make a relationship between the meaning of the Mushaf or Suhuf at the historical context of collecting the ayat of the Quran and what we see here, because obviously you know that some of the Masahif were not pure because they contained some lahns or they had some mistakes or misreadings, and obviously everything had to be referred to the Prophet's personal mushaf, and the ones that represented truly that personal mushaf. So what I'm
Yes, actually, it even goes further than that. There are many. I mean, I don't know if it's for Tafsir al-Tabari, for instance, and also in Ibn Kathir himself, they say that Suhuf al-Mutahara refers to the scribes of the Quranic revelation that is protected, that Allah is telling Muslims long before it happens that the Quran's authenticity and purity will be preserved and protected.
yes, of course. Obviously, that's a major aspect of it.
So I mean, it's
Ibn Kathir has said that.
Yeah.
But what I think is because the Kitab was in the process of being written
Yeah.
or created. So I mean, I don't know. You correct me if my understanding.
Also for
of the,
Kutub al-Qayyimah, you mean?
and Kutub al-Qayyimah refers to
The
previous
earlier
books.
revelation, yeah.
Because we have
Yeah.
that we know that one of the sources of fiqh, at least, that the
Yeah,
traditional fiqh is shara'i min qabl.
Shara' min qabl.
So, my understanding of the very concept of Bayyinah is that it consists of Suhuf al-Mutahara, Kutub al-Qayyimah, and of course the Tilawa,
Yeah.
and that inner call that you said, and that it could
Yeah.
include even wahy, in the way that we see in the Quran that the wahy is being revealed to flies, for example.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, to the bees, and so forth. So everything that comes from Allah.
Yeah, but I think, yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you. That I think that's the next level.
That's the next level.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because you know you go through you go through the tafsir. You know, I mean, as in order to narrate something, you also have to categorize it into something manageable.
Okay.
But yes, Bayyinah, at the next philosophical level, it's or even theological level, it incorporates all of that, and the revelation itself, including the inscription and the Lawh al-Mahfuz and you know, because we get into I mean, look at the extent to which the very concept of bayan sparked the philosophical movement in Islam. That its flame didn't die for centuries. I mean, and I don't think it's an accident. I mean, the more the more the very early pioneers pondered the concept, the more it sparked in them an entire intellectual movement.
Okay, 1, 2, and 3.
No,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Go ahead, Sharon.
So when we talk about mukhlis, it was just worshiping Allah because of Him, and not to displease Him. The you know, for Him, purely for Him. I'm wondering if could it also be, you know, the fear His punishment, and also, I mean, is it only purely worshiping Him because you love Him? Could it be because you fear His punishment as well? Could they be intertwined, or would that not be the mukhlis?
I think that the nature of human being is very different. You can't actually I now remember something that question that sparked that actually is very important, and I think this is maybe something that I had wanted to. Now, this is a very interesting, a very interesting discussion. That if either I'll find it or I'll just paraphrase it. And that is when in the context of talk about ikhlas, one of the most fascinating discussions about Surah Bayyinah that about the nature of love and ikhlas and rida. When you start out, and I'm here, I'm paraphrasing the text. You start out in a state of complete tranquility and security as a fetus in your mother's stomach. You're born. Your consciousness mixes between elements of security, and you're starting to become aware of the coldness of the material world by having the bosom of your mother, but at the same time you're exposed to the elements. You gain, bit by bit, the sense of tranquility and repose is stripped away as you become more and more exposed to the materiality and the elements of the world and utility, the sense of being physically happy, physically unhappy. Now, the important thing, and where the quote gets interesting, is the process of falling in love is reversing this order. So it's as if returning your relationship with Allah is as if you are becoming in Allah's bosom and eventually in Allah's womb. So you start out at the beginning of the journey in very much like you separated, and then you grew up, and then first you and this is if I really like this part of the quote where it says that first human beings they're longing, so they fall in love was, and and in the case of, he's talking about men, so he says that men fall, they want their mothers, so they fall in love with body parts of women. But they long for God, but it, the process of progression, and of course in the case of he so anyway, so the process of migration, very few people are able to actually go back, reverse that process and get to the womb. Yeah, is it possible to as if you become in God's womb and no longer fear punishment or think of reward? Yes, it's possible. But that requires completely a complete transparency and a complete awareness of who you are, and then a complete effacement of the ego. And a fool who claims to have achieved that status. All of us struggle with, and all of us have moments where we feel in the God's bosom, and moments where we feel distant and alienated. And in the same way, I mean, the part of the journey of what you learn from Sufism is that Sunan al-Kawn is the laws of creation, teaches you, it's sort of like a huge lesson as to how the journey towards God. What is the function of law? Law doesn't teach morality. Law reminds people of boundaries and threatens punishment. So in the hope that people, at the moments of weakness, the fear of punishment will bring them back to their senses and to their sense of morality. If the law punishes, though the habitual offenders, the law actually no longer rehabilitates them, it just puts them away. So the role of punishment is to hopefully wake you up in that moments of weakness, so you continue back to your journey. But if you live your relationship to Allah is entirely the punishment, then there is a very serious problem. But one should not freak out when the fear of punishment plays the same role like the fear of getting caught by a cop at the times that you're tempted to not observe the law. We're not tempted to break the law all the time unless we're really criminal, but we now and then need the fear of the law to bring us back into hopefully what is a civil conduct, a civil behavior. And that's a healthy relationship. Now, and it's the same thing, the other opposite side of the coin is not taking God for granted, because on the other side is those who just simply say, oh, Allah will forgive everything, as if and that's the other side of the ugliness of just living in absolute fear, is where you simply take God for granted and completely transform God into your Hawa. But the height of wisdom in the beginning of the past is awareness of the past. And that's where everything starts. And the more one is aware, the more the progress is made. In ways where the true transformative moments is the moments that the divine intervention comes, because you keep making struggling steps. You struggle, you know, one step forward, one step back, until that point where the the grace of God comes in, and then you're traveling, no longer traveling steps, you're traveling miles at a time. And you know it when it comes. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. But no one achieves it from simple, from feeling presumptuously entitled to it. I mean, it's actually the moment where you truly, humbly believe that you're no longer entitled to it. That it, I think most people who experience it tell you that that's when it comes.
Last two questions. So let's go ahead and hear the questions and then we'll answer.
So you are saying that the word min has two meanings. First one is lil juz and second one is lil kul, lil tabaid or lil istighraq.
Yeah.
And then there is Abul Mansur al-Maturidi says that Ba'dul mushrikin finnar la kullul mushrikin.
Right.
My first question is this the common position of classical mufassirun? And then the second position is, the second question is, I think we also need Qarina when we bring the meaning of this verse to Ba'dul mushrikin, not kullul mushrikin. So what is the Qarina, either from the other verse of the Quran or Hadith, that this is Ba'dul mushrikin, not kullul mushrikin?
There's Sister and Anthony had a question.
Oh,
to like,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, this sort of kind of harkens back to what we talked about in Surah Al-Humaz. I don't know if you remember where, I forget who you quoted, but it was, I think, one of the Muslim theologians that said, to be a kafir, to be a mu'min is not an ethical category, but it's just a description. Because I think in this surah, I feel like that lesson is kind of there as well, where
the quote that you're referring to is referred to kufr, not shirk. Kufr.
Yeah, kufr. Yeah. So, well, one, is there a distinction effect between kufr and shirk? Because it seems to be. And two, does this sort of kind of harken back to what we talked about in Surah Al-Humaz, where being a mu'min or not is not necessarily an ethical category, but just a different categories of distinction. Because it seems like with this surah, the ethical dimension is to not hide what you have become aware of. In this case, it would be the Ahlul Kitab and the Mushrikun being aware that the Prophet is a prophet, but concealing it anyway. Right.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the first, yeah, the issue of men, and that's not that is a very traditional classical position. I'm actually trying to maybe you can find a quote about the men particularly. Because it's very interesting. Yeah, the issue of, the easier is to, if you look up min al-tabaid in any book of grammar, that's quite common. But the issue of whether كل المشركين or not, those, is it a common position? Yes, it's a common position. I mean, you can easily verify that by just looking it up in any of the tafsir that are even like someone like Al-Wahidi, which I brought along, who pretty much says the same thing on this, like Maturidi, although Maturidi's language is usually more eloquent than Al-Wahidi. But what I was the issue of why and what is the qara'in, it is, and if I can find it, I want to read to you the why part. It's usually their qarina is the Quran itself. In other words, they're trying to understand the Quran in relation to the other parts of the Quran. So that whether this is a khas or am or to avoid understandings of the Quran that would bring the Quran into contradiction with itself. That's usually the type of systematic reasoning through it. So there is a quote that, if I can find it, it would be nice. I mean, of course, the bigger issue that you often is what do we exactly mean by mushrikeen? Because if you're talking about mushrikeen, those who worshipped Lat wal Uzza and so on, that's one thing. But if you're talking about shirk as a theological concept, those who associated partners with Allah, not in a legal sense, but in a theological sense, then that would be quite broad, and that's why the whole impetus for tabayid comes from, because the Mufassirun were quite, like Maturidi, were quite aware that beyond the worshipping of idols, which by their time had already, by Maturidi's time, had already become pretty much extinct. In fact, he claims he doesn't know of any mushrik in Jazirat al-Arab from a historical sense. But the ishraq الفعلي or الإشراق الحقيقي is a far bigger problem that a lot of people fall in. You know, like عبادة المال and so on. But if I can find it, it would be nice. إلا الله لا يغفر أن يشرك به ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن على الكفر والشرك واحد ويكون كان يشرك. No, it's not Maturidi. I have the quote. No, it's not Maturidi. I have the quote that I'm looking for. Anyway, for the interest of time, and say that the qarina, they would not, especially if you're talking about the time of Maturidi, which is the 4th century, I think he died in the early 330s or something like that. It's not an issue of of reconciling the Quran with the Hadith. It's the issue of reconciling the Quran with itself. And that's usually but I mean, I don't know if although he says that not kulli mushkin, I don't know if he actually I think he had the quote, the part of the river is that where he says that we're not talking about the mushrikeen of Muhammad, we're talking about the mushrikeen in aqaidiyya, which is because he seems to accept the idea that the mushrikeen of Muhammad is a special status, a special category, which would be very consistent with how most theologians have dealt with it. Anyway, if I find the text, I'll tell you where. I'll tell you where. It was, but it's. No, maybe it wasn't. Okay, go on. Oh, is that it?
Did you answer Anthony's?
What did I leave out? What did it?
No, it's okay. I was just asking about whether or not this sort of kind of harkens back to something we talked about in Surah Al-Humazah about kafir and mu'min not necessarily being ethical categories, and how it seemed to be like in the beginning of the verse, and basically thematically speaking, the ethical category seems to be not necessarily about whether someone's Ahl Kitab or Mushrik, but whether or not they do the thing that the first verse calls them out, as in like concealing the truth when you know it to be true.
Yeah, this is actually a really good question. The part that you have in mind where about the kufr, where it was I forgot which source now, but it basically was saying that
it maybe was Maturidi again. I think you maybe I can't remember.
Yeah,
I didn't write it down.
where he says basically that that everyone that kufr is a relative term because you could be mu'min b'shay or kafir b'shay, and so. But what's really interesting is that when it comes to talking about those who denied the message of the Prophet, that their crime is concealing, and that is repeatedly pointed out, that they knew and they lied, they suppressed, and not only they lied and suppressed, but they also misled others, like the Arab tribes that looked to them for authority or authoritativeness. But the other part that I think that is the sort of moral nuance that is sparked by, or the discussion, a nuanced discussion that is sparked by this, and this is in from Al-Razi. So he's when he's talking about what is so ugly and about rejecting or not worshiping Allah. He has this sort of a what's the word I'm looking for, where you go off on a tangent.
Like a
Devil's advocate, or
No, like you go off on a
Tangent?
like a tangent, or you just go, you start talking about and he says that the morality, the ethics say that you are obligated and tuhsin ila man ahsana ilayk, that Allah's ihsan, Allah's kindness precedes yours. So Allah gives you the ni'am, and the various ni'am of eyesight, I said, life itself, consciousness and so on. But that kufr al-ni'mah is fundamentally a moral flaw because you respond to the ihsan by an isa'ah, which I find really interesting. So he says, it says أن الإساءة على قسمين، إساءة إلى من أساء إليك وإساءة إلى من أحسن إليك، وهذا القسم الثاني هو أقبح القسمين، والإحسان أيضا على قسمين، إحسان إلى من أحسن إليك وإحسان إلى من أساء إليك، وهذا أحسن القسمين. فكان إحسان الله إلى هؤلاء الكفار أعظم أنواع الإحسان، وإساءتهم وكفرهم أقبح أنواع الإساءة، وعلوم أن العقوبة إنما تكون بحسب الجناية. So he goes on in trying to reason through what is the crime that is committed, why does it deserve and of course in theological words we know that that's quite common, but the relating of kufr to an ethical flaw that violates the principles of justice or ethical reasoning is typical of someone like Al-Razi, who was very much influenced by the Usuli method. And for theologians like Al-Razi, I think it meant a great deal to them to always tie the categories of shirk or kufr, and they often differentiated between kufr and shirk, to ethical flaws and ethical thinking. Now, of course, from within a theologically committed paradigm, because they're if you reject the initial assumption that ihsanullah qad sabaq, then the ethical reasoning itself, can't proceed.
Yeah.
So then, and which is also interesting because in many of them in books on kalam in particular, they have these long discussions about whether it matters that you recognize the ni'am al-mun'am kal-mun'am, whether you recognize that what Allah gives is in fact a ni'mah or not a ni'mah. And they're trying to prove that it doesn't matter if you recognize it, that that doesn't change the status as a ni'mah. That doesn't answer your question, but it goes around your question.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just stay tuned because a lot of these issues are revisited, and it's always when you talk about the tafsir within a particular surah, you're always sort of censoring yourself as to, well, do I talk about this now or do I wait till? And and that's a hard thing to calibrate. So just stay tuned, because we'll come back to this issue in surah that are more connected.
Inshallah. So just a couple of announcements then. So our next meeting, our next Halaqa will be Saturday, May 18th, and that's going to be in the middle of Ramadan, so we'll also have an iftar with that, inshallah.
Not pizza.
We'll think of something a little bit more elevated than pizza.
Potluck, yeah?
Oh, we could do that. I mean, I don't know, whatever.
Pizza's not really left on.
No, it's not really, of course. But on that note, pizza is here, and it's been here for a while. Also because it's kind of late, I know that like after we finish the halakas, people like get excited about, oh, I want to ask the professor this question or that question, but because I'm sure he's tired, we actually had a really long day today, to just try to moderate,
I also feel think I
You overdid it.
no, I think I undermined you.
Oh.
Because what happened, I gave the khutbah in the Islamic Center, and then I forgot I had 3 notebooks full of 20 years worth of notes. 20 years I've been taking notes in these 3 notebooks, and I forgot them at the Islamic Center, where the imam is, and I freaked out. If they're lost, there tons of information and research would be gone. So we ran to the Islamic Center before the Halaqa to get to search for the notebooks. I found them, alhamdulillah. But then we drove back here, and I stole Grace, so I think I unsettled Grace quite a bit. She actually, believe it or not, she actually writes that talk she gives at the beginning of the Halaqa. She actually sits and writes the entire thing, and then delivers it naturally. Without, so I know I ripped her away from her preparations.
I told her it was very natural. I really liked it.
Thank you. I reached this point where I was like, oh my god, I forgot what I wanted to say. And so that's why I said I choked, and I like went, oh no. But you know, I mean, alhamdulillah, actually I have to say, I always pray before, I'm like constantly praying, please God, don't let me make a fool out of myself, and let me say something that is valuable or that is inspiring to someone. And so alhamdulillah, Shireen, like right after the talk, she came up to me and she said, everything you said like touched my heart. I was gonna cry. And I took that as a sign from God that I said what needed to be said. I mean, I always ask God, please just let me say what you want me to say. And say it in
Grace
my
is
way.
always freaking out about what she's going to say about the Halaqa, and like she has more fans than I do.
No, that's true. Yeah, but I have
Those notebooks should be scanned though.
That might help.
Those notebooks that you're about to, it should
Oh,
be scanned.
I have a bag that has about 20 because I never thought. I
Well,
went
she
to,
does send it to your news, and it's just, it'll be shared actually.
but alhamdulillah, they have been found.
Alhamdulillah.
I really thought, what if like the cleaner just takes them and throws them away? And,
Alhamdulillah.
Oh, we're gonna miss Maghrib.
10
this-
minutes. And then we'll have pizza. Nobody's allowed to leave without taking pictures.
Thank you very much.